Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you for joining me. Tonight we're off to the Peak District again, a very strange place and one I mentioned in my last video. And as many of you know in the Bigfoot research community, sometimes we get reports of very strange lights, sometimes described as white or blue and flickering off on the moors or within the woodlands, and these are some accounts of some of the strange lights that were reported. And when I did the video on the Peak District, a gentleman got in touch with me in the comments there and he mentioned these lights to me, and I hadn't heard them before, so I wanted to bring them to you, and they're as new to you as they are to me, but they do remind me of an account that I know from the Victorian area, also on the peaks, of a strange wild man that was hunted by the police there, and one of the strange structures that he left behind. And I have added a link to that account in the description below if you want to see said structure. So here we go. The Ghost Lights of the Devil's Elbow. Now, the Ghost Lights of the Devil's Elbow is an area of the peaks. It's a really strange, windy road. If you had to describe a really spooky road that you wouldn't want to break down on, that's the place. And as you know, the Devil's Elbow kind of says it all, doesn't it? And this is a quote from one of the witnesses. "We had no idea what was happening or where it was coming from or what it was. I still don't, and I can't explain it to you, but I know what I saw." And that was a lady called Laverne Marshall. And Laverne described herself as a Derbyshire housewife. And she was then describing a terrifying night on a drive into the twilight zone, which had become etched upon her memory, she said. Laverne had taken her son to Heathrow Airport, so she was returning to her home in the town of Glossop, across a lonely road in the High Peak. With her in the back seat of the car was her 20-year-old daughter Stacey and a young baby. "We were just driving and talking when all of a sudden these little balls of light, 4 or 5 in all, appeared on the dashboard," Laverne said. "They were really bright and dancing up and down, just like they were being captured by a juggler. The first thing I did was look up to see if a plane was going over, but there was nothing above us. There were no houses around and there were no headlights behind me. I said to Stacey straight away, 'Take that torch off the baby,' but she shouted back, 'Mum, I've got the torch in my hand and it's not turned on.' So Stacey grabbed the baby off the back seat and held her, and as she did so, these lights moved onto the roof of the car. Powerless to help and not willing to stop the car on an isolated road, surrounded as it was on all sides by miles of featureless moorland, Laverne watched the lights in the mirror as they slowly moved around inside the car. Stacey panicked, locked the central lock in and slid the cover over the sunroof. Then the lights sort of split up into 2 groups, and as we sat speechless, they went to the back of the window, and then they moved back in the single file to the dashboard, where they then regrouped, almost as if they were marching in order. Now, the family's nightmare lasted a full 7 minutes as their car travelled from the highest point on the Woodhead Pass into the darkened Longdendale Valley, blinking out when the car reached streetlights and safety. As we got near the youth hostel at Crowden, there's a turn to Glossop, which takes you past the Devil's Elbow. But even though I was running short of petrol, I wouldn't go down that part of the road, because it's even spookier than the main road. Laverne confessed, "They don't call it the Devil's Elbow for nothing. Many a strange thing happened on that road." Both Laverne and her daughter were left profoundly disturbed by the strange encounter with the lights, which happened close to midnight on a cold, clear evening in February of '95. I woke up the next morning and thought, oh my God, what was it? What did I see? Then I thought, someone's taking the mick, and I explained that to Stacey, and Stacey said, "Well, you've not, you've seen it. You can take the mick if you like, but we have seen it." Sean Wood wouldn't take the mick. His window looks directly onto the carriageway of the busy Trans-Pennine Woodhead Pass, where the Marshalls had their frightening encounter with the unknown. He told a local newspaper with blunt sincerity, quite simply, there are bright lights which appear at the top end of Longdendale. There's no doubt they exist, but what they are, I have no idea. Sean described the lights he had seen, pointing towards Shining Clough, a rugged and desolate mountain ridge. He first saw the lights there in the early 1980s, shortly after his family moved to live at Bleak House, which stands directly below Woodhead's 14th century Chapel of Ease. It was about 9:30 p.m. on a November evening when I walked into one of the front rooms at Bleak House, he said. I walked in to chastise someone for shining a torch through the window, Sean explained. Of course there was no torch, nor indeed any person outside. However, the light filled the room with a chilly moonlight glow. The effect was heightened by the lack of street lighting at this altitude, and when I went outside to investigate, I saw a large pulsing ball of light directly above the house, not too far from the aptly named Shining Clough. With the hair on the back of my neck bristling, I went to telephone my near neighbours at the Cowden Youth Hostel. Guess what? They were already outside watching the light in the sky too. This was just the beginning. 2 years after that, I saw it again, beneath the skyline. In all, I've seen them more than 30 times over the years I've been here. One of the times it was very, very big, and between 50 and 70 feet from the ridge, and it was pulsing again and stopping, moving back and forth and up and down. I've also seen 3 lights together, much smaller in size, like in a string, moving in an arch. I've seen these a few times, and also the big ones, I've seen those also a few times. Now, Sean Wood is just one of the many Longdendale residents who have experienced the phantom lights, which haunt Bleaklow and the Woodhead Road in the valley below. Now, the Woodhead Pass is one of the main arteries linking Yorkshire with Manchester, and it cuts across the Pennines. And it's beautiful up there, but it is desolate. And it's about 2,000 foot above sea level. And there's a river up there, and it flows out to the Irish Sea. So fewer than 40 people, mostly farmers, live within the tiny parish of Woodhead. A population which has swelled to more than a couple of hundred, just once in its long and eventful history. In the 19th century, Irish workmen and their families were imported to carve the huge Woodhead railway tunnel out of the gritstone rock. Since that time, the string of reservoirs have now been constructed in the valley bottom to serve Manchester, and these are now accompanied by miles of high-tension electricity pylons. Now, some have claimed the heavy traffic and reservoirs and pylons have spoilt Longdendale's natural beauty. When visitors climb away from the valley bottom, however, you come out onto this exposed moorland with crags, and it's just beautiful, and it just rises dramatically. Longdendale has a strange atmosphere and a long history of supernatural happenings which stretch back to the dawn of history. Local residents will speak in whispers about the reputation of the valley and tell you that an elemental presence has made its home on those moors for as long as the memory of man can stretch. The Longdendale Lights, which haunt the Gritstone Crags on the north face of Bleaklow, are well known, and they are so well known they've become part of the folklore of the region. Just one aspect of their otherness of the valley. Stories describing them can be traced back through the generations, and in tales handed down through the centuries, the sinister lights are known as the Devil's Bonfires. In tradition, they were said to hover around a mysterious mound near the summit of the Bleaklow Massif, known as Torside Castle. Some archaeologists believe the mound dates back to the Bronze Age. One resident remembers how back in the decade following the end of the Second World War, his grandmother would point towards the looming moors visible from their home in Old Glossop and refer to the lights which flickered and hovered around the Devil's Elbow. Many attempts were made by local people to account for lights seen on the hills during the war, from decoy flares dropped by the RAF to lure German bombers away from big cities to exploding ammunition used by paratroopers who were trained on the moors. Those accounts have run for a very long time, not just during the war. And then 10 years later, as a volunteer in the newly formed Volunteer Mountain Rescue Team, one of the members heard about the lights again when motorists began to report balls of fire resembling distress flares hovering above the hills. This was in the early years of the fledgling mountain rescue service, when walkers were advised to take flares with them for use if they became lost or stranded on the moors. Even then, the reports left experienced climbers baffled. During the 1960s, the new Peak District National Park Authority built the first youth hostel in Crowden, not too far from Woodhead. Now, the hostel was designed to provide an overnight resting place for any walker or traveller braving the first leg of the newly opened Pennine Way footpath, which crosses Longdendale on its route north. And it wasn't long before visitors and wardens based at the hostel and surrounding cottages began to see beams and pulsating balls of coloured lights racing along the rocky gritstone crags on the remote western face of Bleaklaw, among Bramar Edge and the aptly named Shining Clough. On occasions, police and mountain rescue teams turned out to search the mountains but found nothing. Then one fine summer's evening in July 1970, a teacher named Barbara Drabble was driving her Morris Oxford home to Cowden past the youth hostel when she suddenly passed through an invisible curtain which led directly into the twilight zone. The experience was still clearly etched upon her memory when she described it again almost 2 decades later. A brilliant, incandescent blue light was how she remembered the strange glow. It lit up all the bottom half of the mountain, all of the railway and the reservoir and about a 2-mile stretch of road. The lights lasted several minutes and did not resemble daylight. They were brighter, clearer and harsher, and as Barbara drove into the light, she felt intensely cold, a sensation which caused the hair on the back of her neck to stand on end, as if it had been subjected to an electrical charge. It was just all over the whole valley, lighting up, the perfect clarity, every single feature, and it was certainly bright enough to drive without lights, and I can remember the clarity with which I could see the contour of the stone walling and the features on either side of the hills behind the side of the road. Now, the drive must have taken about 5 minutes, and when I parked, or more accurately, hurriedly abandoned the car on arriving home, it had an icy sheen and felt cold. Now, Barbara was so intrigued that she made a point of visiting local farmers and asking them what they knew about the light. She said they shuffled uncomfortably when put on the spot by an outsider and kept what they knew to themselves. She said, I drew a blank from everyone, but their attitude made me feel that they did see something, she said. Then 1 year later, dozens of people staying at Cowden Youth Hostel, including the warden Joyce Buckley, were dazzled at the same or a similar brilliant light which shined in through the windows. At first I thought it might be car headlights, but it reappeared on top of Bleaklaw, and no car can get up there, said Mrs. Buckley, who now lives in Manchester. It lasted more than 3 minutes and was very powerful. Now, the warden was so concerned about the light that, fearing there had been an accident or a plane crash on the mountains, she called out the mountain rescue search party, led by Mrs. Drabble's husband. Ken Drabble was a senior warden for the Peak Park based in Tintwistle during the 1960s, when the rescue service received up to 60 distress calls every year. Now, in 1995, he told someone he clearly remembered the night he was contacted by Mrs. Buckley at the youth hostel, and he described how they could see a very bright light on Torside Clough, opposite Cowden. He said, at first, I thought they'd see a distress flare or an illuminator of some kind, because people do send rockets up if they're in trouble, and these can light up quite a large area. Although distress flares should be red, sometimes they can be white and other colours. On arrival at the hostel, Ken met more than a dozen residents who had seen the dazzling lights on the mountain. Now, the lights had also been seen by farmers and residents of Bleak House further east at the head of the valley. In a moment of madness, he said, I decided to go up the hill with lights of my own, he said, taking a walkie-talkie and a gas-powered searchlight. Ken leapt into a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and with a rescue team, he climbed to the summit of the mountain ridge where the lights had appeared. Now, when we got to the top, there was nothing. No trace of people, lights, or even a fire, he said. Now, the people at the hostel could see our lights from the top of the hill, and we were carrying large gas-powered searchlights whose reflectors were the size of a dustbin lid. But the people down below said they were not even a candle in comparison with the lights that they had seen. They said they could hardly see the lights that we were carrying. Now, the mystery light, they said, had filled a whole valley with its radiance. And discussing the events of the night for a TV reconstruction in 1996, Mr. Drabble, now a retired chief ranger of the Peak National Park, said, "I did not think someone was playing a trick. There were 15 people at the hostel that night, and they did see something, and I would not disagree that it was something very mysterious." That mystery continues today, and the most common description has been of a string of moving lights which has been mistaken for hikers' torches high on the mountainside. Others have seen balls of pulsating light and searchlight beams. One former resident of the area wrote from her new home in California to describe her experience with the lights after reading an article in the Peak District magazine. And back in the early 80s, she would regularly drive through the Longdendale Valley to visit her parents in South Yorkshire. And on her return journey, she would often see dancing lights racing across the mountains at Woodhead and Crowden. At first, I thought they were hikers, but common sense and logic soon ruled this out, she said. There were 3 moving lights, orange or yellow in colour, and they seemed to follow me for about a mile and then disappear. It was hard to tell what size they were, but they were not very big, probably the size of a tennis ball, from where I was in my car looking up into the hills. Now, these phenomena have been reported racing along the 15-mile mountain ridge south of the valley from Torside Castle and Bramon Edge. In the west to Shining Clough, which overlooks Sean Wood's home, if you remember, at the head of the valley. So persistent have these reports become that a voluntary mountain rescue team have turned out from their Glossop base on a number of occasions when lights and flares have been reported to the police, only to find that the lights fade away like will-o'-the-wisp as they approach. Now, the team's commander, Engineer Philip Shaw, became fascinated by the lights after he spotted a mystery beam of light on Bleaklow in the early 80s, and he now keeps a log of sightings. Between them and the 7 mountain rescue teams in the Peak are called out at least once a year by people who see lights in the hills and assume someone's in trouble, he said. This has been going on for at least 20 years, but no one's ever been found. Now, the reports have become so regular that the police no longer pass on sightings of mystery lights to us unless they feel it's a genuine sighting of a distress flare. And a spokesman for the National Grid has heard the stories and rules out the pylons which crisscross the valley bottom as having any connection with the lights. He said arching and sparking could be visible in wet weather and polluted air conditions, but the glow produced by it would be very difficult to spot from ground level. Another rare electrical phenomenon, ball lightning, has also been considered and found wanting as a result of the history and long duration of reports from the valley. This point was made eloquently by a Longdendale resident whose family farmed land near Twintwistle for 3 centuries. He remembers hearing stories about the lights from his grandparents, which dated back to the latter part of the 19th century. And over the years, people used to say these lights could be seen above Nell's Pike, a pointed rock above the Devil's Elbow, and the moors beyond that. One farmer said, back in the olden days, people put it down to witches and ghosts. Now it's all UFOs and flying saucers. Today's people across the world can watch the skies from the Devil's Elbow thanks to a unique internet website which is dedicated to the study of the Longdendale and its mysteries. The Haunted Valley website was created by a paranormal investigator, Debbie Fair, who has set up a live webcam linked to the computer which looks out over the Derbyshire moors from her home in Glossop, weather and visibility permitting, and anyone who lives up there will understand why I smiled at that one. Now, the webcam allows visitors to scan the skies 24 hours every day and join in with regular organised sky watchers. I've been up the peaks a fair few times in my youth, and sometimes the mist can be at the top of your wellies and it can just come in like that really, really quickly. And there's an account here from Eyewitness, and it's the blue lights of 2008. And the witness states, my uncle was driving back towards New Mills after visiting a friend in the Holmfirth area. It was late and dark, and I think it must have been about 2 years or so before his death, so I would estimate that the incident occurred in 1998 or thereabouts, and he was somewhere between Holmfirth and Glossop. He didn't go into any more detail than that, but reading your description of the Longdendale Valley, I suspect he must have been in that area or very near it. He told me that suddenly he and the surrounding landscape were lit up by an incredibly blue light, and I wondered if it might have been simply a police helicopter or a searchlight. But like Barbara Drabble, my uncle said that it lit up the area for miles around, so that he could see the details of the massive areas of landscape. I have a vague recollection that he mentioned coldness, as did Barbara Drabble, but he definitely mentioned that he arrived home and realised that he had absolutely no memory of anything after the sudden blue light. He couldn't recall anything of the remainder of the journey home. I simply don't remember how I got home, he said, and those words really struck me. As I said, my uncle was a very down-to-earth, straight-talking Yorkshireman prior to this incident, and he would jokingly dismiss anything strange or even spiritual as mumbo-jumbo. Indeed, he was very reluctant to talk about what had happened. I heard about it through his son and later managed to convince him to tell me about it. And he was still extremely reluctant when he did eventually talk to me and explain. And this makes me wonder how many people have experienced this and for whatever reason have not told anyone about it. I will never forget what he told me, and I'm usually grateful and really quite spooked to find the website and be able to report this. He's talking about a blog that's out there online, and I've put the link to the blog in the description below. And there's another account in the same blog, and it says Incredible Blue Lights in January 2009. I've just been surfing the internet to try and find any walks in the Longdendale Valley when I came across your site. And I started to read it, and the hairs on the back of my head suddenly stuck up. A young lady had the exact same experience as had myself, and this is the first time in 36 years I've told anybody about what happened that night. At the time, I was working for the AA, which is the Automobile Association, in Cheadle-Hulme, and I'd been out for a Friday night drink with my girlfriend because I intended to pop home to Leeds that weekend to see my parents. Now, I'd taken her home around midnight and I'd decided to go to Leeds via the Woodhead route. So there I was, happily driving my new Ford Escort, playing my 8-track stereo, and just gone through Hyde and was heading up towards the moors. I'd just passed a turn off on the right for Glossop, and I was heading uphill when all of a sudden this incredible pure blue-white light suddenly engulfed the whole area. I slammed the brakes on and just looked in awe because everywhere around me was as bright as day. Brighter than day because everything was just so clear. I noticed an electric train in the valley bottom hauling a long line of coal tubs, and I could see every detail of it. All the conifers on the far side of the valley were crystal clear. I jumped out of my car and just stood and stared and tried to find the source of the light. But I couldn't. There was no source. It was as if it was just everywhere. I can't have been standing there for more than 10 seconds when pop, the light suddenly went out, leaving me in total darkness. Feeling not a little scared by this time, I jumped back into my car and very apprehensively resumed my journey to Leeds. It was on my mind all the way. I kept asking myself, what was it? Where did it come from? What caused it? I got to my parents' house very early in the morning and I told them what had happened. I don't think they believed me, and from that day on I've kept what happened that night to myself. I would love to know what happened that night, and I'm just so relieved that somebody else has had the same experience. Since that night, I've had first-hand experience with aerial flares, as I now work for the MOD, and even the big artillery or mortar launch ones are only a fraction as bright as the light that night. Now, I know myself of many strange accounts, and I've brought them to you reported across the peaks, and there was one account, quite a strange one, reported to the police in the 1800s, and that's on the Derbyshire peaks. And it was a number of reports that came in of a wildman that had accosted a number of ladies on the links there. Now, when he was running from the bushes, all hairy and exposed, he caused the women of high standing to run with their skirts held aloft. Now, this happened on 2 occasions, and this strange hairy man was also reported by a number of villagers and travellers around the reservoir and water sources there, at one point even bathing within the reservoir. When people went out to look, a small shelter was found within the woods, and up to 60 villagers and police alike set out to hunt this strange wildman. They came across him, and he was said to move up the cracks and through the trees with ease. Up the crags, and through the trees with ease, and even the fittest young men could not keep up with his pace. Also reported by a number of people was the strange lights up on the crags moving around, and also some strange lights leading some searchers looking for the wild man off deeper into the woods. The Peaks is a very strange place indeed. Until next time, good night.